the United States and internationally in nearly every industry in the business world, as well as military units, police, fire departments, charity organizations, school administrations, and sports teams. The first law of combat, cover move. This is teamwork. Every individual and team within the team mutually supporting one another to accomplish the mission. Departments and groups within the team, and even those outside the immediate team that are nevertheless crucial to success, must break down silos and work together to win. It doesn't matter if one element within the group does its job. If the team fails, everybody fails. But when the overall team wins, everybody wins. Everyone gets to share in that success. The second law of combat, simple. Complexity breeds chaos and disaster, especially when things go wrong. And things always go wrong. When plans and orders get too complex, the people charged with executing those plans and orders do not understand them. When team members don't understand, they can't execute. Therefore, plans must be simplified so that everyone on the team recognizes the overall commander's intent, the greater purpose behind the mission, and understands their role in achieving mission success. Orders must be communicated in a manner that is simple, clear, and concise. The true test for whether plans and orders are communicated effectively is this: the team gets it. When people on the team understand, they can execute. The third law of combat, prioritize and execute. When multiple problems occur simultaneously, which happens often, taking on too many problems at once results in failure. It is imperative that leaders detach themselves, pull back from the details, and assess to determine the highest priority. Then, once that highest priority task is determined, that priority to the team and ensure the team executes. Then, the leaders in the team can move on to the next priority, then the next. Training and proper contingency planning assist greatly to better prepare teams and leaders to most effectively prioritize and execute under pressure in real time. The fourth law of combat, decentralized command. No one leader can manage it all or make every decision. Instead, leadership must be decentralized, with leaders at every level empowered to make decisions right down to the frontline troopers in charge of no one but themselves and their small piece of the mission. With decentralized command, everyone leads. To empower everyone on the team to lead, team members must understand not just what to do, but why they are doing it. This requires clear and frequent communication up and down the chain of command, and most importantly, trust. Team leaders must have confidence that they clearly understand the strategic mission, the commander's intent of their boss, and the parameters within which they can make decisions. Senior leaders must trust that their junior leaders will make the right decisions and encourage them to do so. This requires training and frequent communication to implement with maximum effectiveness. There is one big problem with extreme ownership: the type. It's probably the most important leadership foundation in the book. It is also slightly misleading. Extreme ownership is the foundation of good leadership. But leadership seldom requires extreme ideas or attitudes. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Leadership requires balance. We addressed that concept in Chapter 12 of Extreme Ownership, Discipline Equals Freedom, the dichotomy of leadership. But as we assessed legions of leaders, companies, teams, and organizations as they implemented the principles of the book, many struggled to find that balance. This struggle represents the biggest challenge to any team as we train and advise hundreds of companies and thousands of leaders over the past few years with our leadership consulting company, Echelon Front. In the final chapter of Extreme Ownership, you wrote, every leader must walk a fine line. Leadership requires finding the equilibrium in an economy of many seemingly contradictory qualities between one extreme and another. The simple recognition of this is one of the most powerful tools a leader has. With this in mind, a leader can more easily balance the opposing forces and lead with maximum effectiveness. Every behavior or characteristic carried out by a leader can be taken too far. Leaders can become too extreme and upset the balance required to effectively lead a team. When balance fails, leadership suffers and the team's performance rapidly declines. Even the fundamental principles of combat leadership in extreme ownership can get out of balance. A leader can cover and move too much and step on the toes of other leaders with or divisions. A plan can be too simple and fail to cover likely contingencies. A team can go too far to prioritize and execute, resulting in target fixation, loss of situational awareness on newly emerging problems and threats. Decentralized command can also be taken too far, when too much autonomy is given to subordinate leaders who then don't fully understand strategic goals and how to execute in support of those goals. This idea continues on with just about everything a leader does. Leaders must be close with their people, but not so close that it becomes a problem. They must hold the level of discipline, not become tyrannical. Leaders can become too extreme with extreme ownership. When a leader takes so much ownership of everything in his or her world that members of the team feel there's nothing left for which they can take ownership. When this happens, team members will execute only at the boss's specific direction without any group ownership or buy-in themselves, resulting in a team far less capable of overcoming obstacles and accomplishing the mission. Therefore, balance in leadership is crucial to victory. It must be monitored at all times, and it must be modulated to specific situations as they arise. If a team member fails to perform adequately, for example, a leader must get down in the weeds and micromanage that member until he or she executes correctly. But once the team member gets back on track and resumes effective performance, the leader must maintain the ability to back off and give that team member room to take greater ownership and manage tasks on his or her own. It is not easy to maintain the constant shift, continual modulation, and frequent adjustment necessary to balance all the dichotomies across every spectrum of leadership characteristics. Yet this skill is essential for effective leadership. We have observed these struggles continuously in good leaders striving to be better. That is what drove us to go deeper into the concept of the dichotomy of leadership. The goal of this book is to help leaders overcome that struggle through examples of how to find the right balance of leadership, to moderate the idea of leading from the extremes and focus on maintaining balance within teams, among peers, and both up and down the chain of command. Every good leader must develop the ability to recognize, understand, and adjust that balance. While it isn't easy, through knowledge, disciplined practice, and sustained effort, anyone can master finding the equilibrium in the dichotomy of leadership. Those who do will dominate their battlefield and lead their teams to victory.
Resolute, but not overbearing. Think better. South of Mali, Iraq, 2006. Bright orange tracers, shoot like laser beams, just leap over our heads. Each supersonic bullet, zipping past and the coverage crack. Holy shit, I thought. We put the fuck down behind me. Those are friendly shields. I looked over the window, crashed over the wall. Like the other shields were refills, each had to stay low enough to not get a headshot. Dave looked back at me and shook his head with a smile, and was humor and concern. That's not cool, Dave said, the understatement of the year. Dave Burke was a U.S. Marine Corps major, a fighter pilot by trade. He had been the lead instructor of the legendary U.S. Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun. Dave had left the cockpit behind and volunteered to serve on the ground as a forward air patrol in the most dangerous place in Iraq, Ramadi. He led a supporting arms liaisons, or SALT, attached to the U.S. Marine Corps 5th Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company. Dave and his 12 Marines, SALT 6, accompanied Charlie Platoon to coordinate the aircraft supporting this operation in the skies overhead. They patrolled in with us on foot to spearhead the operation ahead of the U.S. Army and the Iraqi Army units. A U.S. tank 200 yards away had fired a burst from its heavy machine gun directly over our position. It was friendly fire, a blue-on-blue U.S. military parlance. To be killed or horribly wounded by enemy fire was one thing. To be killed by our own American forces was something much worse. That was way too close for comfort, I thought, in the seconds following, as I crouched as low as possible behind a low concrete wall that was our only means of cover. We had to shut that down immediately and alert the tank that we were friendly forces. To do so, I had to contact the specific tank commander directly via radio and tell them to cease fire. The tank's heavy machine gun was a 50 caliber M2 Browning. Known as a Maw Deuce, it packed a hell of a punch. In U.S. military service since 1933, it proved its deadly effectiveness every 100%. Each massive round could take a man's head clean off or remove the bullet from his chest cavity. It could also punch holes through concrete walls like a water hiding behind. We had just received a fully automatic burst, probably a dozen rounds in a matter of seconds. If I didn't shut down that fire immediately and let the U.S. tank know it was friendless, it could be horrible business and death for every one of us. Moments before, I stood with several Charlie Platoon SEALs on the rooftop of our Iraqi house in the territory. Dave stood next to me, communicating with the U.S. Air Force AC-130 Spooky gunship circled high overhead, giving away awesome fire battle and exchanging their thousands of feet in the night sky above. The first U.S. troops on the ground was following the Navy. We patrolled in on foot several hours earlier and set up a sniper-only watch position to disrupt any attacks from insurgents on the main force of the operation. Some 50 U.S. tanks and armored vehicles and nearly 1,000 U.S. Iraqi troops led by Task Force Band, 1st Battalion, 37th Armored Regiment, goes on the move. Our SEAL snipers were set up in shoot positions along with machine guns and security teams. Dave and his boys regularly were on the rooftop with us, relaying updates from the Spooky gunship overhead. We watched as the heavy phalanx of American Army, M1 A2 Abrams tanks, and M2 Battalion vehicles rode in our direction, crossing the middle of the bridge over the canal, and following the road that led to the village in the position. To clear the field of view for our snipers, our explosive ordnance disposal, or EOD, bomb technicians, and SEAL breachers put explosive charges in place and knocked down several bomb trees. We've taken great steps to alert Task Force Band, the battalion, companies, and platoons to the exact location of our sniper overwatch, so they wouldn't mistake us for enemy forces. It also marked our position with a predetermined signal device. But I hadn't considered how dangerous it was for us to set out the explosives to take out the trees. This was one of the first major operations to seize, clear, hold, build strategy, to take back the money from the deadly insurgents who controlled the border. And it was a historic and massive operation. It had been meticulously planned for weeks, examining every realistic contingency we could imagine. Heavy fighting was expected, as were major U.S. militaries. The soldiers manning the tanks were already on edge, expecting attack as they moved into enemy territory. Though the key leaders had been briefed on the specific building where we planned to set up our overwatch position, that information didn't always get down to the forward troops in the front lines of the operation. And even if the word was passed to the frontline troops, understanding the locations on the battle map and correlating this with the actual street and building seen from the ground level proved difficult at best. I had radioed Jocko, who was co-located with the Army Battalion at the U.S. staging ground across the bridge, that we would be conducting a controlled detonation, a non-combat explosive of demolition charges that we set ourselves. The battalion acknowledged via radio they understood, but again, that didn't guarantee that the word was passed to the tank crews and that they fully processed what that meant. The tankers had their own challenges and risks in front, significant threat from massive IEDs buried in the road, and enemy attacks from machine guns and RPG-75. The control detonations shattered the quiet, and blasts of fire momentarily lit up the yard, where the Abrams tank commanders must have thought it was an attack. Seeing our silhouette on the rooftop, I think we were in search of fighters, lit us up with a burst from his heavy machine gun. We had been casually peering over the roof, watching the armored vehicles crawl towards us in the tracks, when a burst of 50 cal rounds cracked just over our heads. That set us all diving to the gap to see cover. Every nanosecond counted, as I reached into my ear from my radio. Our typical radio procedures were for me to communicate directly to Jocko, who would then pass the word to the battalion staff who was standing next to me, who would relay to the company, who would relay to the lieutenant, and who was here to take along. But there was no time for that now. Every moment was crucial. I needed to speak directly to that tank immediately, or the next burst of 50 caliber machine gun round might shoot us to bits. Though the 50 caliber was preferable to a massive main gun round or the tank's 120mm smoothbore cannon, which could be next. Quickly, I switched my radio channel dial to the tank's company head, keyed up. Ceasefire, I said. We're shooting the friendlies. The seat of the radio transmission was detached. The shooting stopped. That was a close one, I thought. I wasn't angry, but more concerned with the recognition of how easily friendly operated, despite our extensive efforts to mitigate the risk of blue up. The ability to switch my radio to the internet and talk directly to the tank in which we were taking fire. I know I saved us. It was a mission critical skill, already during nearly every combat operation, as did the other leaders charting the two. Yet, they first arrived in the line, as Seaman didn't understand the best way to work for radio networks, and were unable to directly communicate the radio. In the SEAL teams, we had a different culture, different tactics, and different gear than the U.S. Army and Marine Corps radio. No one was more apparent that in our radio communication work, they used an entirely different system. In order for us to talk to them, we needed to learn how to use their system. Typically, in a SEAL team, a radio is a communication expert who programs the radios and troubleshoots any issues for everyone else on the team. We came to depend on our SEAL radio for everything on the radios. Our previous deployments, we had a problem with the radio, we just popped it out of the door, tossed it to the radio, and fixed and stuff out. Additionally, the leader depended upon the SEAL radio for all communications back to the tactical operations center and all units outside of the SEAL squad. In Ramadi, we often woke up with small units, and there weren't enough SEAL radio to go around. You might very well find yourself serving as a radio for an element, and the actual SEAL radio for a different element, a squad, a separate building, or a different operation altogether. As Tasman commanded, and the prior SEAL radio in his best days, Jocko understood that each member of Tasman Bruiser had to be confident in their abilities. We knew we all individually needed to learn how programming works, so that any one of us could talk directly to the soldiers and Marines we fought alongside, depended on for help when we found ourselves in a jam. It was a skill critical to save lives and health. Everybody, make sure you know how to program your radios, Jocko commanded, during an early brief in the Charlie 2 mission planning space. Even among SEALs, Jocko was a big, mean-looking, and intimidating guy. You might think that whatever Jocko said, we were going to do it, if not because we feared his wrath, because we were seeking his leadership and experience. But we didn't learn how to program a radio. At least most of us did. We knew that we didn't think it was important, and that we didn't respect Jocko. But we simply were overtasked. With a hectic schedule, other pressing issues always took precedence. Jocko's order to learn how to program radios slipped to the back. Most of us never got around to it. A few days after Jocko's recruitment, and we had to learn to program a radio, Tasman Bruiser put together a plan with senior approval to launch on a 90-day capture and kill of the Iraqi Syrian terrorist cell responsible for both the deadly attacks on U.S. and Iraqi troops in the line. Charlie took heavily and came up with a plan. Just as we did by every operation, we gathered the troops to mission groups, known as operational or operative. The key leaders stood up and presented their respective parts of the plan. We talked through the details, answered the main questions. As we were wrapping up the operation, Jocko stood up and raised his final strategic comments. Finally, he asked a question and caught us red-handed. Does everyone know that program of radios? Jocko asked. They went downstairs, but nobody had knowledge to say no. I thought we didn't have time. We didn't make time. But Jocko didn't need to hear an answer. No doubt, he could tell from the downstairs or the response that most of the operators were unscrewed the connections to his headset, unplugged the fast tech fastener, pulled the radio from his gear, and handed it to Jocko. There was a function on the radio that would clear its memory, requiring it to be reprogrammed. Jocko cleared the radio and handed it back to Biff. Reprogram that, Jocko corrected. Biff stared back blankly. He didn't know how to reprogram his radio. It was an uncomfortable place to be, called out in front of everyone in the SEAL platoon and Tasker, having failed to comply with Jocko's order. But he wasn't alone, as most of us were in the same boat. Jocko wasn't angry. He understood that many of us were hadn't learned to program our radios, not through willful disobedience, but because we hadn't fully understood its importance. Since we didn't fully understand the importance, we didn't make the time to learn. Yet, Jocko wasn't backing down. He didn't let it go. Jocko held the line and forced a standard. Jocko knew that when we were out on the battlefield, and smaller elements beyond the reach of help or support, we had to be able to operate the radios ourselves. With decentralized command, it was crucial that leaders at every level be fully self-reliant, ready to step up and execute to accomplish the mission. Turning to Charlie to senior SEAL radio, he said, "Teach Biff how to program his radio." To the rest of us in the platoon, Jocko added, "Everybody else, make sure you know how to program your radios. It can save your life. And if you don't know how to program them by the next mission, you're not going outside the wire." By the next combat operation, everyone in the platoon, every SEAL and Tasker and Bruiser, knew how to program their radios. We had practiced it multiple times. The boss had called us all out and made it clear that he fully expected his order to be carried out, no exceptions. For leaders, it is often a struggle to know when and where to hold the line. In SEAL teams, just as in any organization, leaders can constantly crack their whip on their team and verbally berate their people over trivial issues or despised and respected. Those leaders are ineffective, and few will follow them in the matters. A leader cannot be overbearing. But the dichotomy here is that a leader cannot be too lenient and let things slide if the safety, business success, and long-term good of the team are at stake. And Jocko did not call us out to prove we could program our own radios. We would never have done it. It's quite likely that our inability to do so would have cost us. I certainly would never have been fully confident in talking to record soldiers' words on their commitment to radio nets. If Jocko had not done this, they truly have been taking care of the operating capacity. The answer is most certainly not. But Jocko understood that taking care of people is looking out for the long-term good of the teacher's mission. There are some standards that simply cannot be compromised. Going forward, everyone in Tasker and Bruiser is confident in programming and utilizing their personal radios. As non-radiomen, we also practice utilizing the larger radios of the radio gear in the event we need them, which happen frequently. As other SEALs visited Camp Body and joined our platoon and task team as scrap hangers on combat operations, the very first thing we taught them was how to program their own radios and communicate directly with the Army and Marine Corps units. Jocko held the line. As a result, we were prepared for the realities of the battlefield, able to mitigate risk and operate most effectively to accomplish our mission. As I reflected upon Jocko's demonstration of leadership responsibility to ensure standards maintained, there were times in my career when I failed to do so. As a young leader, I knew there were times we needed to improve our performance, do another run through the field house when we practice close quarters combat, or add an additional cushion to ensure we were fully prepared. Yet in those moments, I sometimes hadn't held the line. I hadn't pushed the team hard enough. Any additional work or something was going to get pushback and generate points. And there were times when I let things slide, confusing the idea of taking care of the people with allowing them not to work as hard. But in the end, that resulted in mediocre performance. And the team never got better, never held each other accountable. This was a failure of leadership, my leadership. I also recognized the dichotomy. There were other times when I was overbearing. I insisted on doing things a certain way because it was my way, or hard on trivial matters that were strategically unimportant, thinking I was doing right by holding the line. It caused unnecessary friction, stifled growth, and immediate junior leaders on the team stepping up. It prevented us from functioning properly with effective decentralized command. I had seen the work for numerous leaders throughout my career who had been overbearing, but it wasn't their way I wanted to lead. Some of them imposed harsh discipline, screamed at their team, and crushed the morale on the team. No one wanted to follow them. They might accomplish a immediate task, but in the long run, teams grow this way. Often, their negative examples still show me about it. I never want to be a leader. But there are times when every leader was dealing with and allow the team some room to move. In 2005, when we formed up Tasker and Bruiser and started training, we were returning to get to Iraq and getting the fight. We knew we would be ordering large numbers of U.S. soldiers and Marines, infantry, army, and airborne units. They all had strict protocols for their uniforms and combat gear. Soldiers wore their official unit patch and the American flag. Marines wore the American flag and the eagle, flag, and anchor emblem, the symbol of the Marine Corps. In the SEAL teams, SEAL players generally wore whatever the hell they wanted. Often, this was a mix of different uniforms and gear. Early SEALs in Vietnam wore blue jeans and civilian duck hunter camouflage for combat operations. And a lot of SEALs carried on the tradition of dressing unconventionally. Beyond the uniform styles that made us look different from other military units, many SEALs had custom Velcro patches made for our gear. Each SEAL was design a logo and have a patch made for the team. The Tasking Loser, Platoon had a bone frog design, a Delta Triangle, and a frog skeleton. Charlie Platoon had utilized the Cadillac with a 3 and a C for SEAL Team 3 and Charlie Platoon. Beyond unit patches, some of us wore other patches, such as the traditional first U.S. Navy jack, a flag flown from the jackstaff of U.S. Navy Customs, with 13 stripes, the rattlesnake, and the words, "Don't tread on me," adopted from the Gadsden flag of the American Revolution. SEALs would often design their own patches with whatever logo they thought was cool, or a line or a movie quote they found funny. As I kicked off my training cycle at Tasking Loser, one of the patch was a funny, the arrow buried in the air, the funny news. Several SEALs had patches that were more cowbell, inspired by the popular Saturday Night Live Will Ferrell skit of the band Blue Oyster Cult. Other patches were even less professional and far more cool. I knew all the patches were unprofessional. I knew that some of the patches were pretty offensive, and as a platoon commander, I should probably order you guys to get rid of the patches. But I also thought they were funny, and I didn't fully understand the problems something as simple as patches can cause for us to employ alongside army and things. I believe that removing them would look a lot and making them overly harsh. So I did. Jocko recognized that someone who saw these pretty unprofessional patches took them out of context, like the effects, which would cause frictions that might escalate into something serious. Not that Jocko was some virtue-signaling angel. I knew he thought maybe the patches were funny, but he also knew that if there was even a chance that the patches might cause issues for us, it wasn't worth the risk. It could harm our taskers' chances of being selected to deploy to Iraq. What we didn't deploy to Iraq is we hope to do so. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps we worked alongside would initially judge us on this. They took pride in square red uniform as a testament to good order and discipline. Without random, unprofessional patches, the first impression soldiers and Marines would have of Tasking Loser would be good. Jocko knew it was important and had no problem dropping the hammer on the patches. Get rid of the patches, I told him. I told him how to make it happen. Then we addressed the issue to all Tasking Loser personnel. Jocko declared, no more patches for Tasking Loser. The patches many of you have been wearing are unprofessional. I get that they are funny. But funny patches won't help us build strong relationships with the conventional forces we are serving alongside. They will inhibit our ability to operate in army and marine battle space. They will prevent us from getting after the close range and destroy the enemy. No patches. None. Everybody clear? The only exception was the standard American flag patch we were authorized to wear. Jocko's senior enlisted advisor, Tasking senior chief, ensured the boss's order was enforced without exception. Roger acknowledged the military lingo for understood. The task unit, particularly the Charlie Platoon, wasn't happy about it, but everyone understood and would comply. The new standard had been set, the line in the sand drawn. All patches were removed. But as the months wore on and Tasking Loser was selected to deploy to Iraq, I privately felt that Tasking Loser was a historic unit, destined for great things on the battlefield, and we needed to have an official patch. On Liberty one day, when we were out surfing on a rare occasion with Jocko, I talked it over with my close friend, the Delta Platoon commander, Seth Stone. Bro, we need a unit patch for Tasking Loser, I said. I know Jocko said no patches, but I think we should design one and have it made for everyone. Agreed, Seth replied. We both loved and admired Jocko. We respected his leadership. We rarely disagreed with him on anything, large or small. But we knew that having a task unit patch was important for unit cohesion. We knew there was a line between patches that were offensive and a unit patch or a logo that would represent the task unit. We will have to do it in secret, I said, and make sure that Jocko doesn't see it. Let's do it, Seth agreed. Later, back at my house, Seth and I designed 2 different patches to be worn on the shoulder to Jocko. Both patches were circular and desert tan, with Tasking Loser printed across the top. Seth decorated one patch with a cow skull, with downward horns, and the words, "Big balls and cow tap" across the bottom. Big Texas, Seth and I were big fans of the classic country western song by Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys, "Big Balls and Cow Tap." The pun seemed most appropriate as we adjusted we were killing to a body. I designed one patch with Dorothy Marcus, the muscle bound leader of a post-apocalyptic antagonist in a Mad Max movie sequel, A Road Boy, wearing hockey hats and wielding a large caliber handgun. At the base of the patch, there was the phrase, "The Ayatollahs from Lock and Load," barring the title of the story part of Marcus in the movie. With only a couple of weeks left to follow the fulfillment, I hurried and found a shop that could sell our designs, remove the patches, and add an elbow back if necessary for easy application and removal of any combat uniforms. The patches arrived only days before we started flying out. I threw the box unopened into one of my kit bags and packed them on a pallet just before we loaded over the aircraft and would take some seats. Once we arrived in London, I distributed the box from my Jocko's knowledge to the check side. We opened the box and both had no patches for each of the members of the teams. In secret, we distributed patches to everyone in Tasking Loser, except for Jocko and his original court staff. While on base or in combat operations, the visual of Jocko was seen listening to no one wore patches other than a standing event. But each of the SEAL operators in charge of left positions, while in their EOG bomb technicians, Kevin Matches hidden inside the cargo pocket and the shoulder of the Things were Jocko stayed back and never came. As a convoy of companies to place, he gave all over the strong radio. Patches on. He's operated, hold his tasking agent patch out of his cover, and slap it on the radio on the outside of his uniform. And we're now ready to devour his tasking agent and close the and destroy the yard. But as an any violation of rules, it was only a matter of time before we busted. That fateful day happened on one of the first major operations tasking the blizzard just getting. A Ben civilian journalist with the U.S. Army unit who worked outside took some photos of tasking the blizzard to see the action. The photos were shared with your higher education, and eventually shared with Jocko as senior list advisor. In the photos, the tasking the blizzard guy could clearly be seen on the shoulders of several of our scenes. The senior list advisor blew up about it and prepared to drop the handle. He was just trying to do his job, and of course Jocko's order. I expected to feel the wrath of Jocko. Since I had orchestrated the violation, I planned to quickly own the wrong punishment. But it didn't happen. And then another day, Jocko did this. I was surprised. Jocko immediately violated his order. Willful disobedience. In this case, Jocko didn't hold the line. There was a saying he said, he let it go. As I thought about why he hadn't done it, which was the order, later, I came home from home to front my house. Jocko had recognized that the Apaches strictly under the rules. They were so strong. Also, he got rid of all the other patches. No longer still urged to sit out offensive and unprofessional patches in the states. Instead, everyone wore the same uniform task force all vegetarian and national uniform. He knew that he would hide the patches before he would hide the patches until he was on the base. While Jocko never told us that he would really the patches, he allowed us to begin the rules. Because the patches were unique and matched our reputation. Rather than alienating us from the slavery of the it's made in their minds that we were cohesive people. And in the Bible, they settled patches with the patches to keep all the power leaders with whom we were close, including the U.S. Army Philip, which I from 12 years on that team. Witnessing how Jocko held the line and opposed his family to ensure that he knew how to program programs, he allowed his business to take us from patches. He had powerful direction and hundreds of dollars in the company. There's a time to stand firm with those roots, and there's a time to get around and allow for the rest of the day. Finding that balance is critical for you to get maximum success from the team. Principle. Leaders, on the one hand, cannot be too leading, but on the other hand, they cannot become overbearing. They must set high standards and drive the team to achieve those standards, but they cannot be domineering and flexible on matters of global strategic goals. To find this balance, leaders must carefully evaluate when and where to justify and when to allow to stop. They must determine when to listen to support leaders, allow them ownership, making adjustments to their concerns and needs. Some have used the term leadership method as a means to understand the careful analysis required for a leader to matter specifically. Leadership method is the recognition that there is a finite amount of power in any leader possesses. It can be exploited foolishly by leaders who follow matters of trivial and strategically unimportant. Such capitalism requires slowly over time to build trust and confidence in the team by demonstrating that they have a long-term goals and mission in mind. Prioritizing their goals ensures cannot be compromised, and holding the line open while allowing us to stay in better, less critical ways is a large use of leadership method. Just as we read in Jocko, he said that the most important explanation of the constituency is wrong. Particularly, when a leader is holding on to their statements, it must always be done with the explanation of why it is important. Why is the head of the country, and what the consequences are of the it must never be done with the because I said so. He said, it was far more difficult and more difficult than they would try to achieve the strength which I was for. As a leader, you have to act for that time. As a leader, you're that time, but never feel never aggressive, uncompromising, and that is very important to the overall ability to change. Application to business. Don't about that, said the Vice President. First General Jordan West, famous U.S. Army General who experts to the legend. How they address that investigation. Exactly the kind of organization that had control. We need people who carry out things Russia does. Tell that way that the Executive Vice President and the Hospital Justice he clearly misunderstood how effective he is in the military to his teams. It's not a rigid authoritarianism. Do this because I say so, or you'll be punished. Sure, there are those in the military.
pistols. Brutal. I still can't do them, mate.
We tried to lead like this, but it was never effective. I sat in the conference room with the EVP to learn more about him and his role in the company. As part of our Echelon Front leadership assessment, the company's leadership development alignment program, such one-on-one meetings were integral to understanding the true challenges within the organization and our leaders, departments, teams, and strategies. For our Echelon Front team, this was critical knowledge that allowed us to tailor our leadership program to address these challenges and implement leadership solutions to get the problem.
Oh, bunch of fuck.
Solved. The EVP company had a long history of quality service, but recently, the company's executive team has set its horizons for expansion beyond the recently focused area that had traditionally been their market. To do this, the company, which had previously relied on the extensive experience and on-the-job training of its frontline leaders, now had to lay down standard operating procedures to try to get each of its teams and each of its divisions operating on the same page. The EVP has sat through the opening leadership presentation I delivered. During the question and answer session following my brief, I had referenced General Patton, and it clearly resonated with the EVP. Discipline equals freedom, the EVP said, quoting Jocko's mantra, which which we had just covered in the training session. I've been trying to instill discipline in our team here. We need a lot more of it. In what way, I asked, interested to hear more. Cell phones, he declared. It burns me up every time we call a meeting. Somebody will inevitably be on their phone. Here I am, up in front of the room, trying to put out some critical information, and I see somebody on their phone answering an email, or somebody steps out of the room to take a phone call as I'm trying to impart key information. They even do it to our CEO, the EVP added, incredulous in such behavior. That can be frustrating, I replied. We see it all the time with our work at Echelon Front. But obviously, there are important things that come up that need immediate attention for the good of the company. Not in my meetings, the EVP boasted. I've made it clear to every one of our department leaders and supervisors there are no cell phones in my meetings whatsoever. How do you enforce that, I asked. Easy, the EVP said. Before every meeting, I make each of them pull their cell phones out of their pockets and physically turn them off. Then they have to hold up their phone and show me it is fully powered down. I won't start the meeting until I see that everyone is compliant. The EVP was smug, clearly proud that he was holding the line, uncompromising in this effort, and enforcing a strict standard routine. What is the team's reaction to this then? I inquired. They cried about it, of course, he answered. But I'm going to keep holding the line, just like Pat would do. How important are these meetings, I asked. Oh, they're important, the EVP insisted. I'm putting out a new standard operating procedures that everyone should now be following. That direction came straight from the CEO, and I'm going to get this implemented no matter how much they resist. Besides, what could be so important that they can't shut off their phones for an hour or two to focus on what I need to discuss with them? Well, I can think of a few things that may take precedence, I said. How about an immediate pressing issue with a major customer that needs quick resolution to preserve the relationship so you don't lose a huge contract? Or a serious quality issue that might result in angry clients and bad press coverage that impacts your market growth? Or a major safety incident that results in serious injury or death? The EVP nodded, agreeing that any of those would take precedent over you. Look, he said, I'm just trying to enforce discipline on the team, like Pat will do, like you and Jocko talk about. If we are disciplined in the small things, won't that translate to discipline in the bigger things? Discipline, even in the small things, is important, I said. But as a leader, you need to carefully balance the dichotomy between these opposing forces, understanding where to stand firm and where to bend. You need to carefully prioritize where you hold the line and enforce standards. I'm sure you've heard the term leadership capital before, I continued. As a leader, you only have so much authority that you can spend, and you need to choose wisely where you apply it. It seems to me you're spending a great deal of your leadership capital on cell phones, when it might be much better utilized elsewhere. You mentioned there is resistance to the new standard operating procedures, I observed. Can you tell me more about that? I'm meeting a lot of resistance, he admitted. A lot of our leaders have their own particular way of doing things, and they don't want to change. Well, that's a pretty standard human response, I said. People want to keep doing what they've always done. It's up to you to help them understand why they need to change, why they need to implement standardized procedures. If they understand how it will benefit them personally, how it will benefit their team, and benefit the overall mission, they are far more likely to embrace the change. Why is it up to me? The EVP inquired. It's their problem. They need to get on board. I've told them over and over again why we need to do this. Frankly, I'm sick and tired of trying to explain it to them. We just need to start holding the line and enforcing standards. Implement the new procedures or else. To me, it was perfectly clear. The EVP's attitude was the major reason most of the company's leaders were pushing back and refusing to implement the new standardized procedures. He had unwisely expanded his leadership capital, enforcing things such as the no cell phone policy in his meetings, with no strategic impact. Meanwhile, he had little leadership capital left to implement the new standardized procedures, which would have major strategic impact on the company's success or failure. It's great that you read some military history, I said, but I think you might have a misunderstanding of how leadership in the military actually works. That stuff you've seen in movies and television shows about military personnel who blindly carry out orders, that isn't true. Military personnel are not Terminator robots that just mindlessly follow instruction, regardless of the outcome. They are thinking individuals who need to understand why they are doing what they are doing. But in the military, don't you have to follow orders? The EVP asked. Even in the military, if you give someone an order that they disagree with or don't believe in, the risk of death or horrible injury to the team is high. You don't think you get any pushback on that? I asked. Of course the team will push back. They may even defy orders or refuse to execute, even if it means a court-martial. The best military leaders, I continued, like the best business leaders, take the time to explain why, so that the team understands it. They don't force things down the throats of their subordinates, and they also don't sweat the small stuff. That way, when they explain the importance of something that really matters, it doesn't get lost on the troops. Then, the troops are far more likely to execute what the leader puts forth. The EVP nodded, beginning to understand that in order to get the team on board with the new standardized process, he needed to adjust his tactics. In terms of strategic importance to the company, I asked the EVP, what is more important, that your leaders not access their cell phones during meetings, or that your leaders get on board with the new standardized process and implement it within their teams? The standardized procedures, of course, the EVP admitted. It's far more important strategically that our leaders implement the new process. Roger that, I said, and you need to be more discerning in expending your leadership capital. Don't waste it on the no cell phone policy. That's hurting your ability to implement the important stuff. This, too, is a dichotomy, I explained. You can't have everyone on their cell phones around an important meeting. So make it clear that cell phones are allowed, but only for the most crucially important matters. But won't that make me look weak? The the EVP asked. I could tell he was probably thinking of Patton again. Actually, I said, it will make you look stronger. It shows that you understand what is strategically important, where to hold the line, and where to be flexible, and give some leeway to your leaders. That will increase your leadership capital for the department leaders you're relying on to implement the new procedures. Now, the EVP began to see how carefully he needed to evaluate when and where to hold firm on standards and where to give. He began to understand that it was his job as a leader, not to say, do it my way or suffer the consequences, but to explain. Most importantly, he now saw the value of balancing the dichotomy, to be resolute, but not overbearing.
This is Jocko Will. We hope.
Thoughts to a deeply rooted plant. The hold that a plant could, perhaps, accept pain which it could in no way escape, or that it could have a presentiment of that which it could not later avoid. To attribute reason and free will to it, at the same time that we considered it a foregone conclusion that the plant could not make any use of its will. Under such conditions, the will and the reason of the plant would of necessity remain sterile. There is a strict corollary between movement and psychic life. This constitutes the difference between plant and animal. In the evolution of the psychic life, therefore, we must consider everything which is connected with movement. All the difficulties that are connected with change of place demand of the soul that it foresee, gather experiences, develop a memory, in order that the organism be better fitted for the business of life. We can ascertain then, in the very beginning, that the development of the psychic life is connected with movement, and that the evolution and progress of all those things which are accomplished by the soul are conditioned by the free movability of the organism. This movability stimulates, promotes, and requires an always greater intensification of the psychic life. Imagine an individual to whom we have predicated every movement, and we can conceive of his psychic life as at a standstill. Quote, liberty alone breeds giants. Compulsion only kills and destroys. Unquote. Section 2. The function of the psychic organ. If we regard the function of the psychic organ from this standpoint, we will become aware that we are considering the evolution of a hereditary capability, an organ for offense and defense with which the living organism responds according to the situation in which it finds itself. The psychic life is a complex of aggressive and security-finding activities, whose final purpose is to guarantee the continued existence on this earth of the human organism, and to enable him to securely accomplish his development. If we grant this premise, then further considerations grow out of it, which we deem necessary for the true conception of the soul. We cannot imagine a psychic life which is isolated. We can only imagine a psychic life bound up with its environment, which receives stimuli from the outside and somehow answers them, which disposes of capabilities and powers which are not fitted to secure the organism against the ravages of the outer world, or somehow lighted to these forces in order to guarantee its life. The relationships which suggest themselves from this are many. They have to do with the organism itself, the peculiarities of human beings, their physical nature, their assets, and their defects. These are entirely relative concepts, since it is entirely a relative matter whether a power or an organ shall be interpreted as asset or liability. These values can be given only by the situations in which the individual finds himself. It is very well known that the foot of man is, in a sense, a degenerate hand. In an animal which had declined, this would be of decided disadvantage. But for man who must walk on the flat ground, it is of such advantage that no one would prefer a quote normal unquote hand to a quote degenerate unquote foot. As a matter of fact, in our personal lives, as in the lives of all peoples, inferiorities are not to be considered as the source of all evil. Only the situation can determine whether they are assets or liabilities. When we recall how variegated the relationships are between the cosmos, with its day and night, its dominance of the sun, its movability of atoms, and the psychic life of man, we realize how much these influences affect our psychic life. Section 3. Purposiveness, teleology, in the psychic life. The first thing we can discover in the psychic trends is that the movements are directed toward goals. We cannot, therefore, imagine the human soul as a sort of static whole. We can imagine it only as a complex of moving powers which are, however, the result of the unit cause, and which strives for the consummation of a single goal. This teleology, this striving for a goal, is innate in the concept of adaptation. We can only imagine a psychic life with a goal towards which the movements which exist in the psychic life are directed. The psychic life of man is determined by his goal. No human being can think, feel, will, dream, without all these activities being determined, continued, modified, and directed toward an ever-present objective. This results of itself from the necessity of the organism to adapt itself and respond to the environment. The bodily and psychic phenomena of human life are based upon these fundamentals which we have demonstrated. We cannot conceive of a psychic evolution except within the pattern of an ever-present objective, which is determined in itself by the dynamics of life. The goal itself we may conceive as changing or as static. On this basis, all phenomena of the soul life may be conceived as preparations for some future situation. It hardly seems possible to recognize in the psychic organ, the soul, anything but a force acting toward a goal, and individual psychology considers all of the manifestations of the human soul as though they were directed toward a goal. Knowing the goal of an individual, and knowing also something of the world, we must understand what the movements and expressions of his life mean, and what their value is as a preparation for his goal. We must know also what type of movements this individual must make to reach his goal. Just as we know what path a stone must take if we let it drop to earth, although the soul knows no natural law, for the ever-present goal is always in flux. If, however, one has an ever-present goal, then every psychic tendency must follow with a certain compulsion, as though there were a natural law which obeyed. A law governing the psychic life exists, to be sure, but it is a mandate law. If anyone feels that the evidence is sufficient to warrant speaking of a psychic law, he has been deceived by appearances. For when he believes that he has demonstrated the unchangeable nature and determination of a circumstance, he has stacked the cards. If a painter desires to paint a picture, one attributes to him all the attitudes which are germane to an individual who has that goal before his eyes. He will make all the necessary movements with inevitable consequence, just as though there were a natural law at work. But is he under any necessity to paint the picture? There is a difference between movements in nature and those in the human soul life. All the questions about free will hinge upon this important point. Nowadays, it is believed that human will is not free. It is true that human will becomes bound as soon as it entangles itself or binds itself to a certain goal. And since circumstances in the cosmic, animal, and social relationships of man frequently determine this goal, it is not strange that the psychic life should often appear to us as though it were under the regency of unchangeable laws. But if a man, for example, denies his relationships to society and country, or refuses to adapt himself to the facts of life, then all these seeming laws are abrogated, and a new law steps in, which is determined by a new goal. In the same manner, the law of communal life does not find an individual who has become perplexed at life and attempts to extricate his feelings for his fellow man. And so we must assert that a movement in the psychic life must arise of necessity only where an appropriate goal has been posited. On the other hand, it is quite possible to deduce what the goal of an individual must be from his present activities. This is of the greater importance because so few people know exactly what their goal is. In actual practice, it is a procedure which we must follow in order to gain the knowledge of mankind. Since movements may have many meanings, this is not always so simple. We can, however, take many movements of an individual, compare them, and graphically represent them. In this way, we arrive at an understanding of a human being by connecting 2 points, where the definite attitude of the psychic life was expressed, in which the difference in time is noted by a curve. This mechanism is utilized to obtain the unified impression of the whole life. An example will serve to illustrate how we may rediscover a childhood pattern in the thought, in all its astonishing symmetry. A certain 30-year-old man of extraordinarily aggressive character, who achieved success and honor despite difficulties in his development, comes to a position in circumstances of greatest depression and complains that he has no desire to work for a living. He explains that he is about to be engaged, but that he looks at the future with great distrust. He is plagued by strong jealousy, and there is great danger that his engagement will be broken. The facts in the case, which he brings up to prove his point, are not very convincing. Since no one can reproach him already, the obvious distrust which he shows lays him open to suspicion. He is one of those young men who approach another individual, feel themselves attracted, but immediately assume an aggressive attitude, which destroys the very contact which they seek to establish. Now, let us plot the graph of this man's style of life, as we have indicated above, by taking out one event in his life and seeking to join it up with his present attitude. According to our experience, we usually demand the first childhood remembrance, even though we know that it is not always possible to test the value of this remembrance objectively. This was his first childhood remembrance. He was at the marketplace with his mother and his younger brother. Because of the turmoil and crowding, his mother took him, the elder brother, on her arm. As she noticed her error, she put him down again and took the younger child up, leaving our bishop to run around crushed by the crowd, very much perplexed. At that time, he was 4 years old. In the recital of his remembrance, we hear the identical notes that he surmised in a description of his present complaint. He is not certain of being the favored one, and he cannot bear to think that another might be favored. Once the connection is made clear to him, our patient, very much astonished, sees the relationship immediately. The goal toward which every human being's actions are directed is determined by those influences and those impressions which the environment gives to the child. The ideal state, that is, the goal, of each human being is probably formed in the first months of his life. Even at this time, certain sensations play a role which evoke a response of joy or discomfort in the child. Here, the first traces of a philosophy of life come to the surface, although expressed in the most primitive fashion. The fundamental factors which influence the soul life are fixed at the time the child is still an infant. Upon these foundations, a superstructure is built, which may be modified, influenced, transformed. A multiplicity of influences soon forces the child into a definite attitude towards life, and conditions his particular type of response to the problems which life gives. Investigators who believe the characteristics of an adult are noticeable in his infancy are not far from wrong. This accounts for the fact that character is often considered hereditary, but the concept that character and personality are inherited from one's parents is universally harmful because it hinders the educator in his task and cramps his confidence. The real reason for assuming that character is inherited lies elsewhere. This evasion enables anyone who has to pass an education to escape his responsibilities by a simple gesture of blaming heredity for the pupil's failures. This, of course, is quite contrary to the purpose of education. Our civilization makes important contributions to the determination of the goal. It sets boundaries against which a child batters himself until he finds a way to the fulfillment of his wishes, which promises both security and adaptation to life. How much security a child demands in relationship to the rationales of our culture will be known in his life. A By security, we do not consider only security from danger. We refer to that further coefficient of safety which guarantees the continued existence of a human organism under optimal circumstances. In very much the same way that we speak of the quote coefficient of safety unquote in the operation of a robotic machine. The child acquires this coefficient of safety by demanding a quote unquote plus factor of safety greater than is necessary merely for the satisfaction of his given instincts, greater than is necessary for acquired development. Thus arises a new movement in his soul. This new movement is very plainly a tendency for domination and superiority. Like the grown-up, a child wants to outdistance all his rivals. He strains for a superiority which will vouchsafe him that security and reputation which are synonymous with the goal he has previously set for himself. There, as well as a certain unrest in his second child, which becomes logically accentuated as time goes on. Suppose that the world requires a more intensive response. If in this time of need the child does not believe in his own ability to overcome his difficulties, we will notice his strenuous evasion of he will make the underlying thirst for glory the more evident. In these circumstances, the immediate goal frequently becomes the evasion of all their difficulties. This type recoils from difficulties or wriggles out of them in order temporarily to evade the demands of life. We must understand that the reactions of the human soul are not final and absolute. Every response is but a partial response, valid temporarily, but in no way can be considered a final solution of the problem. In the development of the child soul especially, we are reminded that we are dealing with temporary crystallization of the goal ideal. We cannot apply the same criteria to the child soul that we use to measure the adult psyche. In the case of the child, we must look farther and question the objective to which the energies and activities working themselves out in his life would eventually lead him. Could we translate ourselves into his soul, we could understand how each expression of his power was appropriate to the ideal which he had created for himself as the crystallization of a final adaptation to life. We must assume the child's point of view if we want to know why he acts as he does. The feeling probably connected with his point of view directs the child in various ways. There is the way of optimism, in which the child is confident easily solving the problems which he needs. Under these circumstances, he will grow up with the characteristics of an individual who considers the tasks of life eminently within his power. In his case, we see the development of courage, of openness, frankness, responsibility, industry, and the like. The opposite of this is the development of pessimism. Imagine the goal of a child who is not confident of being able to solve his problems. How dismal the world must appear to such a child. Here we find timidity, introspectiveness, distrust, and all those other characteristics and traits with which the weakling seeks to defend himself. His goal will lie beyond the boundaries of the attainable, but far behind the finding of life. Chapter 2. Social aspects of the psychic life. In order to know how a man thinks, we have to examine his relationship to his fellow men. The relation of man to man is determined on the one hand by the very nature of the cosmos, and is thus subject to change. On the other hand, it is determined by fixed institutions such as political traditions of the community or nation. We cannot comprehend the psychic activities without at the same time understanding these social relationships. Part 1. The absolute truth. Man's soul cannot act as a free agent because the necessity of solving the problems which constantly arise determines the line of its activity. These problems are indivisibly bound up with the logic of a man's communal life. The essential conditions of this group existence influence the individual, yet the facts of the communal life seldom allow themselves to be influenced by the individual, and then only to a certain degree. The existing conditions of our communal life, however, cannot yet be considered final. They are too numerous, and they are subject to much change and transformation. We are hardly in a position to completely illuminate the dark recesses of the problem of the psychic life and understand it thoroughly, since we cannot escape from the meshes of our own relationships. Our sole recourse in this quandary is to assume the logic of our group life as it exists on this planet as though it were an ultimate absolute truth, which we could approach step by step after the conquest of mistakes and errors arising from our incomplete organization and our limited capabilities as human beings. An important aspect of our considerations lies in the materialistic stratification of society, which Marx and Engels have described. According to their teaching, the economic basis, the technical form of this, determines the quote, ideological, logical superstructure, unquote, the thinking and behavior of individuals. Our conception of the quote, logic of human communal life, of the quote, absolute truth, unquote, is in part in agreement with those concepts. History and our insight into the life of the individual, that is, our individual psychology, have taught us, however, that it is occasionally expedient for the individual to make a mistaken response to the demands of an economic situation. In attempting to evade the economic situation, he may become inextricably entangled in the meshes of his own mistaken reactions. Our way to the absolute truth will lead over countless errors of this kind. Part 2. The need for communal life. The rules of communal life are really just as self-explanatory as the laws of the climate, which compel certain measures for the protection against cold, building of houses, and the like. The compulsion toward the community and communal life exists in institutions whose forms we need not entirely understand, as in religion, where the sanctification of communal formulae serves as a bond between men. Of the community. If the conditions of our life are determined in the first place by cosmic influences, they are also further conditioned by the social and communal life of human beings, and by the laws and regulations which arise spontaneously from the communal life. The communal need regulates all relationships between men. The communal life of man antedates the individual life of man. In the history of human civilization, no form of life whose foundations were not laid communally can be found. No human being ever appeared except in a community of human beings. This is very easily explained. The whole animal kingdom demonstrates the fundamental law that species whose members are incapable of facing the battle for self-preservation gather new strength through herd life. The herd instinct has served humanity to this end. The most notable instrument which it has developed against the rigors of the environment is the soul, whose very essence is permeated with the necessity of communal life. Darwin long ago drew attention to the fact that one never found weak animals living alone. We are forced to consider man among these weak animals, because he likewise is not strong enough to live alone. He can only offer little resistance to nature. He must supplement his feeble body with many artificial machines in order to continue his existence upon this planet. Imagine a man alone and without an instrument of culture in a primitive forest. He would be more inadequate than any other living organism. He has not the speed nor the power of other animals. He has not the teeth of the carnivore, nor the sense of hearing, nor the sharp eyes, which are necessary in the battle for existence. Man needs an extensive apparatus to guarantee his existence. His nutrition, his characteristics, and his style of life demand an intensive program of protection. Now we can understand why a human being can maintain his existence only when he has placed himself under particularly favorable conditions. These favorable conditions have been offered him by the social life. Social life becomes a necessity because through the community and the division of labor in which every individual subordinated himself to the group, the species was enabled to continue its existence. Division of labor, which means essentially civilization, alone is capable of making available to mankind those instruments of offense and defense which are responsible for all its possessions. Only after he learned the division of labor did man learn how to assert himself. Consider the difficulties of childhood and the extraordinary precautions which are necessary for keeping a child alive during its first days. This care and precaution could be exercised only where there was such a division of labor. Think of the number of sicknesses and infirmities to which the human flesh is heir, particularly in its infancy, and you have some conception of the unusual amount of care which human life demands, some comprehension of the necessity of a social life. The community is the best guarantee of the continued existence of human beings. Part 3. Security and adaptation. From the previous expositions, we conclude that man, seen from the standpoint of nature, is an inferior organism. This feeling of his inferiority and insecurity is constantly present in his consciousness. It acts as an ever-present stimulus to the discovery of a better way and a finer technique in adapting himself to nature. This stimulus forces him to seek situations in which the disadvantages of the human status in the scheme of life will be obviated and minimized. At this point arises the necessity for a psychic organ, which can affect the process of adaptation and security. It would have been much harder to have made an organism out of the primitive and original man animal, which would be capable of fighting nature to a standstill, by the addition of anatomic defenses such as horns, claws, or teeth. The psychic organ alone could render first aid quickly and compensate for the organic deficiencies of man. The very stimulation growing from an uninterrupted feeling of inadequacy developed foresight and precaution in man, and caused his soul to develop to its present state, an organ of thinking, feeling, and acting. Since society has played an essential role in the process of adaptation, the psychic organ must reckon from the very beginning of the conditions of human life. All its faculties are developed upon an eidetic basis, the logic of human life. In the origin of logic, with its innate necessity for universal applicability, we should doubtless find the next step in the development of man's soul. Only that which is universally useful is logical. Another instrument of the communal life is to be found in articulate speech, that miracle which distinguishes man from all other animals. The phenomenon of speech, whose forms clearly indicate its social origins, cannot be divorced from this same concept of universal usefulness. Speech would be absolutely unnecessary to an individual organism living alone. Speech is justified only in community. It is a product of communal life, a bond between the individual and the community. Proof for the correctness of this assumption is to be found in those individuals who have grown up under circumstances which have made contact with other human beings difficult or impossible. Some of these individuals have often evaded all connections with society for personal reasons. Others are the victims of circumstance. In each case, they suffer from speech defects or difficulties and never acquire the talent for learning foreign languages. It is as though this bond can be fashioned and retained only when the contact with humanity is secure. Speech has an enormously important value in the development of the human soul. Logical thinking is possible only with the premise of speech, which gives us the possibility of building up concepts and of understanding differences in values. The fashioning of concepts is not a private matter, but concerns all society. Our very thoughts and emotions are conceivable only when we premise their universal utility. Our joy in the beautiful is based on the fact that the recognition, understanding, and feeling for the beautiful are universal. It follows that thoughts and concepts like reason, understanding, logic, ethics, and aesthetics have their origin in the social life of man. They are at the same time bonds between individuals whose purpose is to prevent the disintegration of civilization. Desire and will may also be understood as aspects of man's situation as an individual. Will is but a tendency in the service of the feeling of inadequacy, an instrument for the attainment of the feeling of a satisfactory adaptation. To, quote, will, unquote, means to feel its tendency and to enter into its movement. Every voluntary act begins with a feeling of inadequacy, whose resolution proceeds towards a condition of satisfaction, of repose, and totality. Part 4. The social feeling. We may now understand that any rules that serve to secure the existence of mankind, such as legal codes, totem and taboo, superstition, or education, must be governed by the concept of the community and be appropriate to it. We have already examined this idea in the case of religion, and we find adaptation to the community is the most important function of the psychic organ, in the case of the individual, as in the case of society. What we call justice and righteousness, and consider most valuable in human character, is essentially nothing more than the fulfillment of the conditions which arise in the social needs of mankind. These conditions give shape to the soul and direct its activity. Responsibility, loyalty, frankness, love of truth, and the like are virtues which have been set up and retained only by the universally valid principle of human life. We can judge a character as bad or good only from the standpoint of society. Character, just as any achievement in science, politics, or art, becomes noteworthy only when it has proven its universal value. The criteria by which we can measure an individual are determined by his value to mankind in general. We compare an individual with the ideal picture of a fellow man, a man who overcomes the tasks and difficulties which lie before him in a way which is useful to society in general, a man who has developed his social feeling to a high degree. According to the expression of Ferdinand, he is one, quote, who plays the game of life according to the laws of society, unquote. In the course of our demonstration, it will become increasingly evident that no adequate man can grow up without cultivating a deep sense of his fellowship in humanity and practicing the art of being a good being. Chapter 3. Child and Society. Society exacts certain obligations of us which influence the norms and forms of our life, as well as the development of our mind. Society has an organic basis. The point of tangency between the individual and society may be found in the fact of man's bisexuality. Not in the isolation of man and woman, but in the community of man and wife does he satisfy the impulse of life and achieve security and guarantee his happiness. When we observe the slow development of a child, we may be certain no evolution of human life is possible without the presence of a protecting community. The various obligations of life carry in themselves the necessity for a division of labor, which not only does not separate human beings, but strengthens their bonds. Everyone must help his neighbor. Everyone must feel himself bound to his fellow man. The vital relationships of man to man have originated thus. We must now discuss in more detail some of these relationships which greet a child upon his birth. Part 1. The situation of the infant. Every child, dependent as he is on the help of the community, finds himself face to face with a world that gives and takes, that expects adaptation and satisfies life. His instincts are backed by their fulfillment by obstacles whose conquest gives him pain. He realizes at an early age that there are other human beings who are able to satisfy their urges more completely and are better prepared to live. His soul is born, one might say, in those situations of childhood which demand an organ of integration whose function is to make a normal life possible. This, the soul accomplishes by evaluating each situation and directing the organism to the next one, with the maximum satisfaction of instincts and the least possible friction. In this way, he learns to overvalue the size and stature which enable one to open a door, or the ability to move heavy objects, or like others to get to the it is as well to become as strong and stronger than all others, arises in his soul. To dominate those who are gathered about him becomes his chief purpose in life. adults use, and on the other hand, to demonstrate his weakness, which is felt by these same adults as an inexorable demand for their head. We shall continually find this branching of psychic tendencies in children. The formation of types begins at this early period, whereas some children develop in the direction of the acquisition of power and the selection of a courageous technique which results in their recognition. Others seem to speculate on their own weaknesses and attempt to demonstrate it in the most varied forms. One need but recall the attitude, the expression, and the bearing of individual children to find individuals who fit into one group or the other. Every type has a meaning only as we understand its relationship to the environment. Reflections of environment are usually to be found in the behavior of any child. The basis of educability lies in the striving of the child to compensate for his weaknesses. 1,000 talents and capabilities arise from the stimulus of inadequacy. Now, the situations of individual children are extraordinarily different. In one case, we are dealing with an environment which is hostile to the child and which gives him the impression that the whole world is an enemy country. The incomplete perspectives of child thought processes explain this impression. If his education does not forestall this fallacy, the soul of such a child may develop so that in later years he will act always as if the world really were an enemy country. His impression of hostility will become accentuated as soon as he meets with greater difficulties in life. This occurs frequently in the case of children with inferior organ systems, with an attitude entirely different from those who come into the world with relatively normal organs. Organic inferiority can express itself in difficulties of motion, in inadequacies of single organs, or in weakened resistance of the entire organism, which results in frequent sickness. Difficulties in facing the world are not necessarily caused only by deficiencies of the childish organism. The unreasonable demands made on a child by a foolish environment, or the unfortunate manner in which these demands are presented to him, are comparable to actual difficulties in the environment. A child who desires to adapt himself to his environment suddenly finds difficulties lying in his way, especially when he grows up in an environment which has itself lost its courage and is imbued with a pessimism only too quickly transferred to the child. Part 2. The influence of difficulties. In view of the obstacles which approach every child from countless angles, it is not to be wondered at that his response is not always adequate. His psychic habits have but a short time to develop, and the child finds himself under the necessity of orienting himself to the unchangeable conditions of actuality, while his technique of adjustment is still immature. Whenever we consider any number of mistaken responses to the environment, we find ourselves dealing with constant developmental attempts on the part of the soul to make a correct response and to progress throughout life as in a continual experiment. The thing which we particularly see in the expression of the child's behavior pattern is the type of response which an adolescent gives in a definite situation in the course of his maturation. His response attitude gives us an insight into his soul. We must, at the same time, take cognizance of the fact that the responses of any individual, just as those of society, are not to be judged according to a pattern. The obstacle a child meets with in the development of his soul usually result in a stunting or distortion of his social feeling. They may be divided into those which arise out of defects in his physical environment, such as originate in abnormal relationships in his economic, social, racial, or family circumstances, and further into those which arise out of defect in his bodily organs. Our civilization is a culture which is based upon the health and adequacy of fully developed organs. Therefore, a child whose important organs suffer defect is at a disadvantage in solving the problems of life. Children who learn to walk late, or who have difficulties of any kind in locomotion, or those who learn to speak late, who are clumsy for a long time because the development of their cerebral activity takes longer than in the case of the usual child belonging to this class. We all know how such children are constantly bumping themselves, are clumsy and slow, and carry with them the burden of bodily and psychic sorrows. They are obviously not tenderly touched by a world which was not appropriately fashioned for them. Difficulties which arise out of some such inadequate development are many. Of course, there is always the possibility that in the course of time, a compensation is established automatically without a scar remaining, if the bitterness of the psychic need has not, in the meantime, developed in the child an attitude of despair which is felt in his later life. Such a state of affairs may be complicated, in addition, by economic helplessness. It is easy to understand that the fixed laws of human society are but poorly comprehended by effectively equipped children. They look with suspicion and mistrust at the opportunities which they see developing around them, and have the tendency to isolate themselves and evade their tasks. They have a particularly sharp sense of life's hostility, and they unconsciously exaggerate it. Their interest in the bitterness of life is much greater than its brighter side. For the most part, they overrate both, so that theirs is a lifelong attitude of belligerency. They demand that an extraordinary amount of attention be paid to them, and of course they think far more of themselves than of others. They conceive of the necessary obligations of life more as difficulties than as stimuli. Soon, a gulf, which is continually widened because of their hostility to their fellows, builds itself between them and their environment. Now they approach every experience with an exaggerated cautiousness, removing themselves farther and farther from the truth and actuality with every contact, and succeed only in continually making fresh difficulties for themselves. Similar difficulties may arise when the normal tenderness of parents toward their children is not manifested to a proper degree. Whenever this occurs, serious consequences for the development of the child ensue. The child's attitude becomes so fixed that he cannot recognize love nor make the proper use of it, because his instincts for tenderness have never been developed. It will be difficult to mobilize a child who has grown up in a family where there has never been a proper development of the feeling of tenderness to the expression of any kind of tenderness. His whole attitude in life will be a gesture of escape, an evasion of all love and all tenderness. The identical effect may be produced by unthinking parents, educators, or other adults who teach children that love and tenderness are improper, ridiculous, or unmanly, by impressing some pernicious motto upon them. It is not so seldom that we find that a child is taught that tenderness is ridiculous. This is especially the case among those children who have often been ridiculed. Such children are terribly afraid of showing emotions or feelings because they feel their tendency to show love towards others is ridiculous and unmanly. They fight against normal tenderness as though it were an instrument to enslave or degrade. Thus, boundaries for the loving may be set in early childhood. After a brutal education in which all tenderness is dammed up and repressed, the child withdraws from the circle of his environment and loses little by little contacts which are of utmost importance to his life. Sometimes a single person in the environment offers an opportunity of concord. When this happens, the child joins himself to his friend in a very deep relationship. This accounts for the individuals who grow up with special relationships connected to but a single person, whose capabilities can be stretched to include more than one other human being. The example of the boy who felt himself neglected when he noticed that his mother was tender only to his younger brother, and therefore wandered up and down through life trying to find a warmth and affection which he had missed from earliest childhood, is a case in point, which demonstrates the difficulty such a person may find in life. It goes without saying that the education of such individuals is under pressure. Education accompanied by too much tenderness is as pernicious as education which proceeds without it. A pampered child, as much as a hated one, labors under great difficulties. Where it is instituted, a desire for tenderness arises which goes beyond all boundaries. The result is that a petted child binds himself to one or more persons and refuses to allow himself to be detached. The value of tenderness becomes so accentuated by various mistaken experiences that the child concludes that his own love enforces certain implicit responsibilities on his grown-ups. This is easily accomplished. The child says to his parents, quote, "Because I love you, you must do this or that," unquote. It is this type of social dogma which frequently grows up within the circle of the family. No sooner does the child recognize a tendency like this on the part of others than he increases his own tenderness in order to make them more dependent upon him. The flaming up of such tenderness to one particular person in the family must always be kept in mind. There is no doubt that the future of a child is influenced injuriously by such training. His life becomes involved in a struggle to hold the tenderness of others by fair means or foul. To accomplish this, he dares to use every means he has at hand. He may attempt the subjugation of his rival, brother or sister, or occupy himself with terror against them. Such a child will actually incite his brothers to misdeeds in order that he may be able to sun himself in the love of his parents in relative glory and righteousness. He applies a definite social pressure to his parents in order to fix their attention on himself. To do this, he will leave no stone unturned until he occupies the limelight and has achieved more importance than anyone else. He is lazy or bad for the sole purpose of giving his parents the task of busying themselves more with him. He becomes a model child because he considers the attention of others a sort of reward. After the discussion of these mechanisms, we may conclude that anything may become a means to an end once the pattern of psychic activity is fixed. The child may develop himself in an evil direction in order to arrive at his goal, or he may become a model child with the same goal in view. One can often observe how one or several children seeks the limelight through particular unworthiness, while another, being shrewder, attains the same goal through particular virtue. With the petted children, we may also group those who have had every difficulty removed from their path, whose capabilities have been belittled in a friendly way. They have never had an opportunity to meet responsibilities. Such children have all been denied every opportunity to make those preparations which are so necessary for future life. They are not prepared to make contacts with anyone who is willing to join with them, and are certainly not capable of making contacts with others who, as a result of difficulties and errors in their own childhood, throw obstacles in the way of human contacts. Such children are utterly unprepared for life because they have never had an opportunity to practice the conquest of difficulties. As soon as they step out of the hothouse atmosphere of the tiny kingdom of their home, they suffer defeats almost of necessity, for the reason that they cannot find any human being willing to assume the duties and responsibilities which they expect at the hands of their paying educators, nor in the degree to which they are accustomed. All the phenomena of this type have one thing in common. They tend to the greater or lesser isolation. Children whose gastrointestinal tracts are defective assume a special attitude towards nutrition, and as a result, go through an entirely different developmental process from children who are normal in this respect. Children with defective organs may have a particular style of life, which may eventually drive them into isolation. There are other children who do not clearly understand their connection with the environment and actually try to avoid it. They cannot find a comrade, hold themselves distinct from the games of their companions, and, either envious of their fellows or despising the play of children of the same age, busy themselves in a shut-in preoccupation with their own private games. Isolation also threatens children who grow up under the pressure of an education not having strictness. Life will not appear in a favorable light to them because they are expecting bad impressions on every hand. Either they have the impression that they must be tolerant of all difficulties and take up their sports in a humble way, or they feel like champions ready to take up the battle with the environment they have always found hostile. Such children feel that life and its tasks are inordinately difficult. It is not hard to understand how such a child is busy working his heart with the defense of his personal boundary lines, lest he suffer some defeat for his personality. We may expect him constantly to retain before his eyes an unfriendly picture of the outer world. Burdened by an exaggerated cautiousness, he develops a tendency to evade all greater difficulties, rather than to lay himself open to the dangers of a possible defeat. A further common characteristic of these pampered children, which is a sign of their inadequately developed social feeling, is the fact that they think more of themselves than of others. In this trait, one sees clearly their whole development toward a pessimistic philosophy of the world. It is impossible for them to be happy unless they find a solution for their false behavior patterns. Part 3. Man as a social being. We have been at some length to show how we can understand the personality of the individual only when we see him in his context, and judge them based on their situation in the world. By situation, we mean his place in the cosmos, and his attitude toward his environment and the problems of life, such as the challenges of occupation, contact, and development, which are inherent in his being. In this way, we have been able to determine that the impression thrown in upon every individual from the earliest days of his infancy influenced his attitude throughout his whole life. One can determine how a child stands in relation to life a few months after his birth. It is impossible to confuse the behavior of two infants after these months, because they have already demonstrated a well-defined pattern which becomes the clearer as they develop. Variations from patterns do not occur. The child's social activity becomes increasingly permeated by his social relationships. The first evidence of the inborn social feeling unfolds in his early search for tenderness and the proximity of adults. The child's love is always directed towards others, not as towards himself. According to the person, these erotic strivings vary in their intensity and manifestation. In children who are more than 2 years old, these differences may be demonstrated in their speech. Only under the stress of the most severe psychopathological degeneration is the social feeling, which has become firmly based in the soul of every child at this time, forsaken. This social feeling remains throughout life, changed, colored, circumscribed in some cases, enlarged and broadened in others until it touches the very members of his general, but also his clan, his nation, and finally, the whole of the earth. It is possible that it may extend beyond to express itself towards animals, plants, lifeless objects, or finally towards the whole cosmos. An understanding of the necessity for dealing with man as a social being is the essential conclusion of our studies. Once we have grasped this, we have gained an important adjunct to the understanding of man's behavior. Chapter 4, The World We Live In. Part 1, The Structure of Our Cosmos. Owing to the fact that every human being must make an adjustment to his environment, his psychic mechanism has the faculty of taking up impressions from the outer world. In addition, the psychic mechanism pursues a definite aim according to a definite interpretation of the world, and along the lines of an ideal behavior pattern which dates from early childhood. Although we cannot express this cosmic interpretation and this goal in a definite and exact term, we can nevertheless describe it as an ever-present aura, and as always in contradistinction to the feeling of inadequacy. Psychic movements can occur only when there is an innate goal. The construction of the premises the capacity for change and a certain freedom of movement. The spiritual enrichment which results from freedom of movement is not to be undervalued. A child who raises himself from the ground for the first time is an entirely new world, and in that second he somehow senses a hostile atmosphere. In his first attempt at movement, and particularly in rising to his feet and learning to walk, he experiences various degrees of difficulty, which may either strengthen or destroy his hope for the future. Impressions which grown-ups might consider unimportant or commonplace may have an enormous influence on the child's soul and eventually shape his impression of the world in which he lives. In this way, children who have had difficulties in locomotion construct an ideal for themselves, which is permeated with violent and hasty movements. We can discover this ideal by asking them what their favorite games are, or what they would like to do when they are grown. Usually, such children answer that they desire to be automobile drivers, locomotive engineers, or the like, thus signifying clearly their desire to overcome every difficulty which hinders their freedom of movement. The goal of their life is to attain a point at which their feeling of inferiority and their sense of handicap is entirely removed by perfect freedom of motion. It is readily understood that such a sense of handicap can originate easily in the soul of a child who has developed slowly or has encountered much sickness in his life. Similarly, children who have come into the world with defects in their eyes attempt to translate the entire world into more intensive visual concepts. Children who have auditory defects show an intense interest for certain tones which seem to sound more pleasant to them. In short, they become, quote, musical, unquote. Of all the organs with which a child attempts the conquest of the world, the sense organs are the most important in the determination of the essential relationships to the world in which he lives. It is through the sense organs that he understands the picture. Above all, it is the eye which approaches the environment. It is the visual world predominantly which forces itself upon the attention of every human being, producing the main data in his experiences. The visual picture of the world in which we live has an incomparable significance in that it deals with unchanging, lasting basis, in contrast to the other sense organs, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and the skin, which are sensitive solely to temporary stimuli. There are, however, individuals in whom the ear is the predominant organ. Here, the psychic fund of information is more particularly on acoustic guidance is created. In this case, the soul will be set by a predominantly auditory constellation. Less frequently, we find individuals in whom motor activity is predominant. A predominance of interest for olfactory or gustatory stimuli determines another type, and of these, the first type, which is more sensitive to smell, is under a relative disadvantage in our civilization. Then, there are a number of children in whom the muscular drug plays a leading role. This group comes into the world characterized with a greater restlessness, which forces them to constant movement in childhood, and to greater activity in maturity. Such individuals are interested only in such activities in which the functioning muscles play the chief role. They exhibit their activity even during sleep, as anyone can prove for himself by observing them restlessly tossing about in their beds. We must class those, quote, fidgety, unquote, children whose restlessness is often considered a vice in this category. In general, we can say that a child who does not approach the world with heightened interest in some one organ or only group, whether these be the sense organs or locomotive apparatus, hardly exists. From the impressions which his more sensitive organ gathers from the world, each child constructs a picture of the world in which he lives. We can therefore understand a human being only with what sense organs or organ systems he approaches the world, because all his relationships are colored by this fact. His actions and reactions gain their value from our knowledge of the influence which his organ defects have had on the constellation of his cosmic picture in his childhood, and thus upon his later development. Part 2, elements in the development of the cosmic picture. The ever-present goal which determines all our activity influences also the choice, intensity, and activity of those particular psychic faculties which serve to give shape and meaning to the cosmic picture. This explains the fact that each of us experiences a very specific segment of life, or of a particular event, or indeed of the entire world in which we live. Each of us values only that which is appropriate to his goal. A real understanding of the behavior of any human being is impossible without a clear comprehension of the secret goal which he is pursuing, nor can we evaluate every aspect of his behavior until we know that his whole activity has been influenced by his goal. A. Perception. The impressions and stimuli which arise in the outer world are transmitted by means of the sense organs to the brain, where certain traces of them may be retained. How these vestiges are built the world of imagination and the world of memory. Perception is never to be compared with a photographic image, because something of the peculiar and individual quality of the person who perceives it is inextricably bound up with it. One cannot perceive everything that one sees. No two human beings are ever going to say the picture. If we ask them what they have perceived, they will give very diverse answers. A child perceives only that in his environment which fits into a behavior pattern previously determined by a variety of causes. The perceptions of children whose visual desire is especially well developed have a predominantly visual character. The majority of mankind is probably visual minded. Others fill in the mosaic picture of the world which they have created for themselves with predominantly auditory perceptions. These perceptions need not be strictly identical in actuality. Everyone is capable of reconfiguring and rearranging his contacts with the outer world to fit his life pattern. The individuality and uniqueness of a human being consists in what he perceives and how he perceives. Perception is more than a simple physical phenomenon. It is a psychic function from which we may draw the most far-going conclusions concerning the inner life. B. Memory. The development of the soul is intimately related to the necessity for activity upon the basis of the facts of perception. The soul is innately related to the motility of the human organism, and its activities are determined by the goal and purpose of this motility. It is necessary for man to collect and arrange his stimuli and relationships to the world in which he lives, and his soul, as an organ of adaptation, must develop all those faculties which play a role in his defense and are otherwise active in maintaining his existence. It is clear now that the individual response of the soul to the problems of life leaves traces in the structure of the soul. The functions of memory and evaluation are dominated by the necessity for adaptation. Without memories, it would be impossible to exercise any precaution for the future. We may deduce that all recollections have an unconscious purpose within themselves. They are not fortuitous phenomena, but speak clearly with the language of encouragement or of warning. There are no indifferent or nonsensical recollections. One can evaluate a recollection only when one is certain about the goal and purpose which it subserves. In understanding why one remembers certain things and forgets others, we remember those events whose recollection is important for a specific psychic tendency, because these recollections further an important underlying movement. We forget, likewise, all those events which detract from the fulfillment of the past. We find, thus, that memory, too, is subordinate to the business of propulsive adaptation, and that every memory is dominated by the goal, which directs the personality as a whole. A lasting recollection, even though it is not, as is often the case in childhood, where memories are frequently surcharged with one-sided pleasures, may be transferred to the realm of the conscious, and appear as an attitude, or as an emotional tone, or even as a philosophical point of view, if this be necessary for the attainment of the desired goal. C. Imagination. Nowhere does the uniqueness of an individual show more clearly than in the products of his fantasy and of his imagination. By imagination, we mean the reproduction or perception without the presence of the object itself, which gives rise to it. In other words, imagination is reproduced perception, another evidence of the creative faculty of the soul. Imagination is not only the repetition of perception, it itself is a product of the creative power of the soul, but it's an entirely new medium built upon the basis of the perception, just as the perception was created on the basis of physical sensations. Now, there are fantasies which far exceed the customary imagination which are presupposed. Such visions are so sharply outlined that they have a value not for imaginary products, but influence the behavior of the individual as though the active stimulating object were actually present. We speak of hallucinations, where fantasies appear as though they would result from an actual present stimulus. The conditions for the appearance of hallucinations are in no wise different from those which are fantastic daydreams. Every hallucination is an artistic creation of the soul, shaped and contemplated according to the goals and purposes of the particular individual in which it appears. Let us make this clear through an example. An intelligent young woman married against the advice of her parents. Her parents were so angry at her mismarriage that they broke off all relations with her. For the course of time, the young woman became convinced that her parents had not treated her well, but many attempts at reconciliation failed because of the pride and obstinacy of both parties. As a result of her marriage, this young woman, who belonged to an honored and wealthy family, had fallen into rather impoverished circumstances. Yet, externally, no one could observe any signs of unhappiness in her connubial relations. This woman quite reconciled to the fact that she had made a adjustment were not for the appearance of any particular phenomenon in her life. This woman had grown up as the favorite child of her father. So intimate had been their relationship that their present breach was the more remarkable. The occasion of her marriage, however, caused her father to treat her very badly, and her rupture was very deep. Even when her child was born, her parents could not be moved to visit their daughter or to see the child. The young woman took the harsh treatment of her parents no more to heart, because, actuated by great ambition, she was touched to the quick by their attitude toward her in a situation in which she might well have been treated with consideration. We must remember that the mood of this young woman was completely dominated by her ambition. It is this character trait which gives us an insight into the reasons why the breach with her parents affected her so deeply. Her mother was a stern, righteous person who had many good qualities, although she had treated her daughter with a helping hand. She knew how to submit to her husband, at least so far as outer appearances were concerned, without really relinquishing her own rank. Indeed, she drew attention to her submission with a certain pride, and considered it an honor. Now, in this family, there was also a son who was considered a chip of the old block and the future heir of the family name. The fact that he was considered somewhat more valuable than our young woman served only to spur her ambition. The difficulties and poverty which this young woman, educated in a comparatively sheltered atmosphere all her life, was experiencing in her marriage, now caused her to think constantly with ever-increasing displeasure about the mistreatment she had received at the hands of her parents. One night, before she had fallen asleep, it happened that a door opened, and the Virgin Mary stepped to her bed and said, quote, "Because I love you so well, I must tell you that you will die in the middle of the second. I do not want you to be prepared." The young woman was not frightened by this apparition, but she went to her husband and told him everything. On the next day, she went to the physician and told him about it. The young woman maintained that she had seen and heard everything quite clearly. At first glance, this seems impossible, yet, when we apply the key of our knowledge, we can understand it quite well. Here's the situation. A young woman who is very ambitious and, as the examination shows, has the tendency to dominate everyone else, except her parents, and finds herself in poverty. It is so understandable that a human being, in an effort to conquer everything in the physical sphere in which he lives, should approach God and converse with him. If the Virgin Mary had remained only an imaginary figure, as was the case in prayer, no one would have found anything particularly noteworthy in this occurrence. But this young woman needed strong arguments. The phenomenon loses all its mystery when we understand what tricks the soul is capable of producing. Is not every human being dreams in a similar position. The difference really is only this, that this young woman can dream while she is awake. We must add, too, that the feeling of depression has placed her ambition under great strain. Now we become aware of the fact that actually another mother is coming to her. Indeed, that mother who in popular perception is the greatest mother of all. These two mothers must stand in certain contrast to one another. The Mother of God appeared because her own mother did not come. The apparition was an accusation against her own mother and her insufficient love for her child. The young woman is now trying to find some way of proving that her parents are wrong. The middle of December is not an insignificant time. It is that time of the year in which people are more apt to consider their deeper relationships, when most human beings approach each other with greater warmth, give presents, and like. It is at this time, too, that the possibility of reconciliation comes closer, so that we can understand that this particular time stands in a close relationship to the quandary in which the young woman finds herself. The only strange thing in this hallucination seems to be that the friendly approach of this Mother of God is accompanied by the sad news of the young woman's approaching death. The fact that she told her husband this vision with an almost happy tone of voice is also not without significance. This prophecy quickly spread beyond the very circle of her family, the physician had learned of it on the following day, and it was thus very simple to bring it about that the mother actually listened to her. A few days later, the Virgin Mary appeared to the same and spoke the same words. When the young woman was discovered eating with her own mother had turned out, she answered that mother could not admit. We see, therefore, the old theme cropping up again. Her desire to dominate her mother had not yet been fulfilled. At this time, it was attempted to make the parents understand what was actually going on in the life of their daughter, and, as a result, a very satisfactory meeting between the young woman and her father obtained. A touching scene occurred, but the young woman was not yet satisfied, because she said there was something theatrical in her father's behavior. She complained that he had led her away too long. Even in triumph, she could not rid herself of the tendency to prove everyone else wrong, and herself to appear in the light of a constant figure. We may conclude from our previous discussion that hallucinations appear in that moment when the psychic tension is at its greatest, and in circumstances in which one fears that the attainment of one's goal is impossible. There is no question that hallucinations will have considerable influence in districts where the population has been somewhat evaporated in days gone by. Descriptions of hallucinations in the writings of travelers are known. The mirages which are seen by wanderers in the desert who have lost their way and are suffering from hunger, thirst, and fatigue are excellent examples. We can understand that the tension which arises when life is in danger compels the imagination of the sufferer to create a clear and refreshing situation for himself in order that he may escape from the unpleasant oppression of his environment. The mirage represents a new situation to encourage the faith, refresh the failing powers of the irresolute, make the traveler stronger or more sensitive, or, on the other hand, it may act as a balsam or narcotic which can rob his misery of its horrors. Hallucination is nothing new for us, since we have already seen similar phenomena in perception, in the case of memory, and in imagination. We shall find these same processes again in lucid dreams. By accentuating the imagination, by excluding the critique of the higher centers, it is easy to produce the phenomena of hallucination. Under circumstances of necessity or danger, and under the pressure of a situation in which one's power is threatened, one strives to obviate the feeling of weakness and overcome it by this mechanism. The greater the tension, the less the consideration which will be paid to the critical faculties. Under such circumstances, with the motto, "Help yourself as you can," unquote, anyone with the aid of every ounce of his psychic energy can force his imagination to project itself into the hallucination. Illusion is closely related to hallucination, the only difference being that some point of external contact remains, but is misinterpreted, as is the case in the story of Goethe's Erlkönig. The underlying situation, the feeling of psychic peril, is the same. Another example will show how the creative power of the soul can produce either an illusion or a hallucination as the need arises. A man of excellent family, who had never amounted to anything because of a bad education, held an unimportant relationship. He had given up all hope of ever amounting to anything. His hopelessness weighed heavily upon him, and in addition, his psychic tension was increased by the repulsion of his friends. In these circumstances, he took to drink, which gave him at once complete forgetfulness and an excuse for his failure. After some time, he was brought to the hospital with delirium tremens. Delirium is specific to hallucination, and in the delirium of alcoholic intoxication, small animals such as mice or insects or snakes frequently appear. Other hallucinations which are related to the patient's occupation may also occur. Our patient came into the hands of physicians who were strongly opposed to the use of alcohol. They put him through a strict course of treatment, and he was completely free of his alcoholism, left the hospital cured, and did not touch alcohol for 3 years. At this time, he returned to the hospital with a new complaint. He stated that he constantly saw a leering, grinning man who watched him at his work. He was now a day laborer. Once, when he was particularly angry because this man was laughing at him, he took his pick and threw it at him to see whether he was a real man or only an apparition. The apparition dodged the missile, but thereupon attacked him and beat him back. In this case, we can no longer speak of ghosts, because the hallucination and ability of fists. The explanation is not like the body. It was his job to hallucinate, and he made his test upon a real man. This shows us clearly that although he had been freed of his desire to drink, he had in reality sunk further since his discharge from the hospital. He had lost his job, he had been put out of his house, and now had to learn his living as a day laborer, which he, as well as his friends, considered the lowest form of work. The psychic tension in which he had lived had not become less. Although he had been freed from alcoholism, he had actually become full of conversation, despite the great advantage of his cure. He could do his first job with the help of drink, but when he was reproached too loudly at home for not accomplishing the drink, the excuse that he was a drunkard seemed less shameful to him than his incapability of holding a job. After this trip, he was again face to face with reality, and in a situation which was in no wise less oppressive than his former one. Should he now fail, he had nothing to console himself with, and nothing to blame, not even alcohol. In this situation of psychic peril, the hallucinations reappear. He identifies himself with the previous situation and looks at the world as if he were still a drunkard, and says very clearly with this gesture that he has ruined his whole life with his drinking, and nothing can be done about it now. By being sick, he hoped to be freed from his little honored and therefore for him very unpleasant occupation as a ditch digger, without having to make a decision for himself. The above mentioned hallucination lasted for a long time, and finally was forced to the hospital again. He could console himself with the thought that he could not accomplish it anymore, after this fortune of drink. This mechanism enabled him to maintain his personal evaluation at a high level. It was more important for him not to allow his personal evaluation to sink than it was for him to work. All his efforts were directed at maintaining the conviction that he might have accomplished great things had he not been visited by misfortune. This was the proof which maintained him in a powerful relationship and enabled him to feel that other men were not better than he, but that an impassable obstacle lay in his way. The mood in which he attempted to find a consoling ally produced the apparition of a dreaming man. The ghost was the savior of his self-esteem. Part 3. Fantasy. Fantasy is but another creative faculty of the soul. Traces of this activity can be found in the various phenomena which we have already described. Just as the projection of certain memories into the sharp of consciousness, or the erection of the bizarre superstructures of the imagination, fantasy and daydreaming are to be considered part of the creative activity of the soul. The prevision and prejudgment, which are an essential faculty in any global organism, constitute an important factor of fantasy. Fantasy is setting up with the mobility of the human organism, nothing more than that of vision and prescience. The fantasies of children and girls, sometimes are always concerned with the future. The actual passage in the air, unquote, are the goal of their activity, built up their fictional form as models for real activity. Examination of childhood fantasy show clearly that the striving for power plays a predominant role. Children deal with the goal of their ambition and their daydreams. Most of their fantasies begin with the words, quote, "When I am grown up," unquote, and the like. There are many adults who live as though they still have to grow up. The clear emphasis on the striving for powers indicates to us, again, that the soul life can develop only when a certain goal has been set. In our civilization, this goal is the goal of social recognition and significance. An individual never remains long at any neutral goal, for the communal life of mankind is accompanied by constant self-measurement, which gives rise to the desire for superiority and the hope of success in competition. The forms of freedom which are so evident in the fantasies of children are almost entirely situations in which the child's power is expressed. We must not generalize here, because it is impossible to lay down rules for the degree of fantasy or the extent of imagination. What we have said before is valid for a number of cases, but may not be applied to some. Those children who approach life with belligerent eyes will develop their fantastic powers to greater lengths because their precaution is stimulated to a greater tension as a result of their attitude. Weak children, for whom life is not always pleasant, develop greater powers of fantasy and have the tendency to occupy themselves particularly in this type of activity. At a certain age in their development, their ability to imagine may become aware of the realities of the fantasy is used as a confirmation of reality. In such cases, it becomes a kind of comedy power, and it bases itself above the meaning of the fictional lever of his imagination. The social feeling, together with the striving for power, also plays a critical role in the fantasy. In childhood fantasies, it is only seldom that power striving to appear without some application of social entities. This trait we see clearly in those fantasies in which the content concerns itself with being a savior or a good knight, a victor over evil forces, devils, and the like. The fantasy that a child does not belong to his own family frequently occurs. Many children believe that they actually originated from a different family, and that someday their real father, some important personage, will come and fetch them. This happens most frequently when children with a deep feeling of inferiority, hounded by the deprivations they have suffered,
17.
are forced into the background, or become dissatisfied with the love and tenderness they receive in their family circle. Ideas of grandeur betray themselves in the external attitude of the child who acts as though he were already grown up. Sometimes one finds almost pathological expressions of this fantasy as disease in children who wear things to without picking up cigar butts in order to appear men, or in case of young girls who decide to become men and wear themselves and dress themselves in a manner more appropriate to boys. There are children who are said to have no imagination. This is surely an error. Even such children do not express themselves, or there are others who develop to take up battle against the appearance. A child may try to feel a certain sense of power by suppressing his imagination. In a cramped striving to adjust to reality, these children believe that fantasy is unmanly or childlike, and refuse to participate in it. And there are cases in which this disinclination goes so far that their imagination seems totally lacking. Part 4. Dreams. General considerations. In addition to previously described daydreams, we must deal with that important and significant activity which occurs during our sleep, the night dream. In general, it may be said that the night dreaming is a repetition of the same process which goes on in daydreams. Old, experienced psychologists have pointed to the fact that the character of a human being may easily be read from his dreams. Actually, dreams have occupied the thinking of mankind to an enormous degree since the dawn of history. In the sleep dream, as in the daydream, we are concerned with the activity of an organism which is attempting to map, plan, and direct its future life toward a goal of security. The most apparent difference is that daydreams are comparatively easily understood, whereas sleep dreams are but seldom comprehended. That dreams are not understandable is not surprising, and we might easily be tempted to find this an indication that they are superfluous and insignificant. For the time being, it might be said that the striving for power of an individual who is seeking to overcome difficulties and maintain his position in the future is re-evident in his dreams. Dreams offer us important grips on the problems of the psychic life. Part 5. Empathy and identification. The soul has the faculty not only of perceiving what actually exists in reality, but also of feeling, of guessing what will occur in the future. This is an important contribution to the function of prevision, necessary to any easily mobile organism, since such an organism is constantly faced with the problem of making adjustments. We call this faculty identification, or empathy. It is extraordinarily well developed in human beings. Its extent is so great that one finds it in every corner of the psychic life. The necessity for prevision is the prime condition of its existence. If we are forced to preview, to prejudge, to presume hardship after a certain situation were to occur, we must learn how to gain a sound judgment of a situation which has not yet occurred through correlation of our thinking, feeling, and perception. It is essential to win a point of view that we may either approach the new situation with more strenuous efforts or avoid it with greater caution. Empathy is given that one person speaks with another. It is impossible to understand another individual if it is impossible at the same time to identify oneself with him. Drama is the artistic expression of empathy. Other examples of empathy are those cases in which someone has a strange feeling of uneasiness and opposes another in danger. This empathy may be so strong that one makes involuntary defense movements, even though there is no danger to oneself. We all know the well-known gesture which is made when someone has dropped his glass. At bowling alley, one may see certain players following the course of the ball with movements of their body, as though they wanted to influence its course by this movement. Similarly, during football games, whole sections of people in the bandstand will push in the direction of their favorite team, or make resistant pressure of the opponent team as the ball. A common expression is the involuntary application of imaginary brakes by the occupants of a motor car whenever they feel that they are in danger. Few people can pass a tall building in which someone is washing a window without experiencing certain contractions and defense movements. When a speaker loses his presence of mind and cannot perceive, people in the audience are oppressed and uneasy. In the theater, particularly, we can hardly avoid identifying ourselves with the players, or prevent ourselves from acting the most varied roles within ourselves. Our entire life is very much dependent upon the faculty of identification. If we seek for the origin of this ability to act and feel as if we were someone else, we can find it in the existence of an inborn social feeling. This is, as a matter of fact, a cosmic feeling and a reflection of the connectedness of the whole cosmos which lives in us. It is an inescapable characteristic of being a human being. It gives us the faculty of identifying ourselves with things which are quite outside our own mind. Just as there are various degrees of the social feeling, so there are various degrees of empathy. These may be observed even in childhood. There are children who occupy themselves with dolls just as though they were human beings, whereas others are more interested in seeing what is inside them. projecting that real relationships are human beings to less valuable or lifeless objects, the development of an individual may be entirely stopped. Cases of cruelty to animals that we see in China were impossible without involving the absence of a social being, ability to identify with other living beings. The consequence of this effect is children to develop instincts which are of very little value or significance for their development into developing beings. They only think of themselves and lose all interest in the joys or woes of others. These are manifestations which are intimately related to a deficient degree of identity. The inability to identify oneself with another may lead so far that an individual refuses entirely to cooperate with his fellow man. Part 6. Hypnosis and Suggestion. Individual psychology answers the question, how is it possible for one individual to influence the behavior of another? By saying that this phenomenon is one of the accompanying manifestations of our psychic life. Our whole theory of life are impossible unless one individual can influence another. This mutual influence becomes rapidly extended in some cases, as for instance, in the relationship between people, between parents and children, between husband and wife. Under the influence of the social field, there exists a certain degree of willingness to influence one's environment. The degree of this influence is dependent upon the degree to which the rights of the one on whom the influence is considered by that of the exercise of the influence. It is impossible to have a lasting influence upon an individual whom one is harming. The influence of another when he is included in the rights guaranteed. Very important point in paradox. Perhaps it is possible to conceive, or even to carry out some other form of education, but a system of education which takes this point into consideration will be adequate for the reason that it is connected with the most primitive instinct of man, the fear of this relatedness to man and the cosmos. It will fail only when it is dealing with a human being who has purposely withdrawn himself from the influence of society. Such a withdrawal does not occur by accident. A lasting war must have occurred, during the course of which his connections with the world little by little, so that now he stands in open opposition to the social theory. Every type of influence upon his behavior is now made more difficult or impossible. One views the dramatic spectacle of a human being who responds to every attempt to influence him with a counterattack of opposition. We may expect that children who feel themselves oppressed by their environment will show a deficient amenity to the influence of their educators. Cases occur, however, in which the external factors that removes all opposition to the result of the authoritative influence is retained and contained. It is easy to prove that disobedience is sterile of all social good. It sometimes manifests itself in such a grotesque fashion that it renders the obedient individual unfit for life. By dint of the servile obedience, such individuals are incapable of any action without an appropriate command from someone else. The great danger of this far-reaching submission carries in itself is to be measured by the fact that there are children who, when they develop adults, obey anyone's commands, even to the commission of crimes. Interesting examples are to be found in gangs. Those who carry out the greatest command belong to this class, whereas the leader of the gang usually holds himself far from the scene of action. In almost every important criminal case dealing with a gang crime, some such servile man has been the cat's paw. This far-reaching blind obedience attains such unbelievable depth that we can occasionally find people who are actually proud of their surveillance and find their way to the satisfaction of their ambition. If we limit ourselves to normal cases of mutual influence, we find that those people are most capable of being influenced who are at most amenable to reason and logic, those whose social feeling has been pieced distorted. On the contrary, those who thirst for superiority and desire domination are very difficult to influence. Observation teaches us this fact every day. When parents complain about a child, it is only very rarely that they do so because of his blind obedience. The most common complaint arises because of his disobedience. Examination shows that such children are caught in a current which would make them superior to their environment. They are striving to batter down the cramping walls of their little life. They have been made unapproachable for educational influence by virtue of a mistaken treatment at home. The intensive striving for power is inversely proportional to the degree to which one can be educated. Despite this fact, our family education is concerned, for the most part, in spurring on the ambition of the child and awakening ideas of grandeur in his mind. This does not occur because of thoughtlessness, but because our whole culture is permeated with similar grandiose delusions. In the family, as in our civilization, the greatest emphasis is placed upon that individual who is greater and better and more glorious than all the others in his environment. In the chapter on vanity, we shall have occasion to show how maladapted this method of education towards ambition is to the communal life, and how the development of the mind can be stunted by the difficulties which ambition places in its way. Every medium is in a position similar to individuals who are influenced by every turn of their environment as a consequence of their unconditional obedience. Imagine obeying every word that anyone voices or shall. Hypnosis is based upon a similar preparation. Anyone may say or feel
Thanks for watching. Cheers, guys.